Hello there, and here we are with the continuation of the presidency series. We are on our third president, Thomas Jefferson. But before we talk about Thomas Jefferson's presidency, which I'm going to dedicate to him in the next episode, this episode is about Thomas Jefferson and his women and his views and actions on slavery. Thomas Jefferson is a very fascinating man, a man I would greatly love to admire, but he also had he's done some despicable things, and we're going to get into all of that. He's a person that I don't want to dismiss, but I can't exactly like. And in spite of all that, everybody loved Jefferson. He had some kind of charm. Even his enemies spoke about this. In the last episode, I mentioned that John Adams felt bitter and betrayed by Thomas Jefferson, and then they became friends again. Let's talk about all of that, but in the meantime, who is Thomas Jefferson? Well, one of our founding fathers. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, minister to France, the first Secretary of State. He was the second vice president and our third president of the United States. He pushed for democracy and republicanism, and he believed in states' rights. He did not believe in a strong federal government. Okay. On a more personal note, lover of the arts, philosophy, naturalist, botany, loved nature, spoke about 5 or 6 different languages, played the violin, learned philosophy, political science. I mean, the man was, I don't know if there was anything out there that he was not interested in. He went to college at 16 and graduated about 2 years later. He founded the University of Virginia. And at one point, he owned 6,500 books. I don't know if he read them all. He was a tremendous, voracious writer. He didn't give good speeches. He was a bit shy when it comes to that. And he opposed slavery, and here comes the main issue here. He opposed slavery, yet he was a slaveholder who owned hundreds of slaves. And some of his actions that I'm going to be talking about, he opposed slavery, but he was the embodiment of what a slaveholder was. As a young lawyer, he actually defended some slaves who were suing for their freedom. There was one client that he had that was suing for freedom. Thomas Jefferson represented him without pay. He lost the case, but then he gave money to this slave to help him escape. He pushed for laws to abolish slavery, but he never freed his own slaves, except for a little handful that we'll talk about later on. He inherited slaves from his dad. When his dad passed away, he inherited slaves when he married his coming-up wife, Martha, and her father passed away. He inherited his slaves. However, he also inherited their debts, and there was a lot of that, and that might be a strong influence in what we're going to be talking about when it comes to the slavery issue. When he was 29, he meets Martha Wales Skelton. She was a widow. She's a daughter of John Wales. They were married 10 years, had 6 kids. Martha was diabetic, and childbirth was very, very stressful for her. Thomas Jefferson and her had the love of music. It was a mutual love of music. She played the piano, he played the violin, and Jefferson said these were the happiest 10 years of his life that he spent with Martha. I mentioned that Martha was diabetic at the age of 33. She passed away. Before she died, she had Thomas Jefferson promise never to remarry. If you wonder why would she do that? Well, she had bad experiences with her stepmothers. She had 2. And she did not want anybody raising her girls. She was very distraught. She passed away. Thomas Jefferson was very distraught. And when she passed away, he locked himself in a room for 3 weeks. Then he would go riding around for hours on his horses. Obviously, life goes on. He started coping, but 2 years later, people thought he was suicidal. He was offered the ministry of France, and he took it. Some say that part of the reason that he was sent to France was because they wanted him to be a little distracted by what had happened to him. So he goes to France. He joins John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was there a short time after Jefferson arrived, and then he returned from France. When he goes to France, he takes his oldest daughter with him. Her name they called her Patsy, and she was 12 years old. He had 2 other daughters, Polly, who was 6, and Lucy, who was 2. He leaves those 2 youngest with someone else, and he goes to France. When he gets to France, his thoughts on slavery were still the same. He opposed slavery, but he started saying that now black slaves and white slave owners could not coexist if in a free society. If we free the slaves, they could not coexist. And his thoughts started changing. Now, how do we change slavery slowly? You can't just free them all. It would be chaos. He feels a resentment would be so strong that these slaves would rebel. While he's there, he meets Maria Causeway. Mrs. Causeway, she was married. Well, he meets Mrs. Causeway and he falls madly in love. Something I have to mention about this. Mrs. Causeway was married to a man who some say was gay, we don't know, but it was an arranged marriage. And it seems like he let her do whatever she wanted and he went off and did whatever he wanted, I don't know. Point being is that she was half Italian, played the piano, and maybe Jefferson thought of his wife, I don't know, but she was a very cultured woman. They went everywhere together. Did anything happen between them? We don't know. We have no way of knowing. But I will say this, they went everywhere together for months. And one day they were walking along and he wanted to show off in front of her, and he jumped the fence and broke his right hand, his writing hand. And he loved to write. Sometime after that, Mrs. Causeway had to go back to England with her husband. Jefferson, with his left hand, wrote a 4,000-word love letter. He called it My Head and My Heart. You can look it up. You can Google it. It's out there. 4,000 words. While he was in France, he associated a lot with Lafayette. Lafayette, if you remember, was a soldier that went to the United States and he fought alongside Washington when he was a very young man. Lafayette actually chastised Thomas Jefferson for having slaves. Yet Lafayette became very close to Jefferson. They became great friends. Sadly, though, when Lafayette arrived, he was in the United States, Lafayette. Lafayette arrives in France, tracks down Jefferson to let him know that his youngest daughter, Lucy, who was about 2 or so, had passed away. Jefferson, distraught, sends for his remaining daughter in the United States, Polly. She's about 9 now. So he wants Polly brought over. So now he wants both daughters, Patsy, who was in France with him, and now Polly, to be there. So Polly is brought over. And when Polly arrives, she arrives with a slave girl named Sally Hemmings. Sally's about 14 years old. I have to stop the story right now to talk about Sally Hemmings. Who is Sally Hemmings? Give me a moment. Sally Hemmings' mother was a slave woman named Betty. Sally Hemmings' father was a slave owner named John Wales. John Wales was Martha Wales, Jefferson's former wife, Martha Wales' father. So this little slave girl, 14 years old, Sally Hemmings, was Martha Wales' half-sister, which means she's sister-in-law to Thomas Jefferson, per se. However, she's a slave. And her dad, it kind of blows my mind. This man hooks up with a slave woman named Betty, has daughters, there were a few, and these daughters are his slaves. His children are his slaves. But anyway, Sally Hemmings arrives. And Sally Hemmings gets very close to Jefferson. She stays in France. By the way, her brother James is there. Jefferson is getting involved with a lot of the French that were pushing for the French Revolution. He embraced the French Revolution, and he actually let Lafayette and others get together in his home. But while he's there, did he get involved with Sally Hemmings? Okay. When they left France, Sally Hemmings was 16. And she was pregnant. Jefferson had promised James, that's Sally's brother, that he would free him in about 2 years or so. He promised Sally that he would free her and any children that she had in the future when upon his death. Keep in mind that in France, if James and Sally had stayed in France, they would have been free. There were no slaves in France, and Jefferson could not have kept her there, brought her back to the United States by force. He couldn't do that. But they decided to come back with him upon those promises. So they left France, and Jefferson becomes the Secretary of State for George Washington. And go back to my previous episodes, you can hear about that. What about Jefferson's daughters? What happened to them? Well, sadly, when Jefferson became president, his youngest daughter, Polly, who was by then 25 years old, she passed away. His remaining daughter, Patsy, had at one point wanted to become a nun while she was in France. But she came back to the United States with Jefferson years later, when he was very old. She took care of him. She did get married. It was a very bad marriage. And when her husband passed on, she went to Monticello. That's the house that Jefferson built, by the way. And she took care of him. She had several marriages and took care of her dad. Now, going back, Thomas Jefferson had promised to free James Hemmings, Sally Hemmings' brother, and he did. In the United States, he did free James. Sadly, though, James succumbed to alcoholism and passed away just a few years after that. Sally had 6 children. Sally Hemmings lived with Thomas Jefferson for about 40 years. She was there by his deathbed. Upon Jefferson's death, the children were freed as promised. And not too soon after that, Sally Hemmings was freed. Patsy freed her as per Thomas Jefferson's wishes. Sally went on to live with 2 of her sons. Of the 6 children she had, 4 grew into adulthood. She went to live with 2 of her sons. By that point, 3 of her children decided to pass themselves off as white. Remember, their mother was half black, it was half black, half white, and then so was her mom, and I believe the mom before that as well. Okay. Was Thomas Jefferson the father of Sally Hemmings' children? Now you might say, this is disgusting. This is his sister-in-law. And besides all of that, she was 16 years old and he was in his mid-40s. Believe it or not, in the 1700s, the age of consent was 10. There were girls getting married at 7 years old. Usually they would wait through puberty before they consummated the marriage, but sometimes that didn't happen. So, very different times. Were they his kids? I believe they were. Some still believe that they were not. And I don't want to get into why I believe so, but you could read up on it. However, I will say this. He did not free any of his slaves, except for the Hemmings. And divine justice here. Remember when Jefferson paid a reporter named Callender to speak badly about John Adams? Well, when Thomas Jefferson became president, Callender came to extort money from him. Jefferson said no, and Callender went out and spoke badly about Thomas Jefferson, and he wrote that Jefferson had children with his slave, Sally Hemmings. All right. Today, there are hundreds of Hemmings descendants and hundreds of Thomas Jefferson's descendants. They get together every year today, but there was a time when they could not get together. The Jefferson clan did not believe the Hemming clan was part of their bloodline. A DNA test was taken, and guess what? There's a connection. Sally Hemmings' descendants today came from a Jefferson. But the deniers are now saying, no, that's not Thomas Jefferson, that's his brother's kids. Sally Hemmings' kids were born from Jefferson's brother. I mean, they're like really stretching and trying to make it so that Thomas Jefferson didn't do anything wrong. Now, why didn't Jefferson free his slaves? Okay, several reasons. He was heavily in debt. When he inherited the slaves, he inherited debt. When he needed money, he would mortgage some of these slaves. Once you mortgage the slaves, you cannot free them. You owe money. I don't know why this man always owed money. I mean, lavish lifestyle, I know, but whatever. Okay. However, Virginia law, in Virginia, in the state of Virginia, if you freed your slave, the slave could not stay in the state of Virginia. The state of Virginia, this is after Washington had already, passed on and his slaves were freed. But now Virginia is saying they wanted no free black people in Virginia. If you were black in Virginia, you were a slave. If you were freed by your master, you had to leave. If Jefferson had freed his slaves, they had to go, leave the state of Virginia, which is not as easy to say. It's easy to say, but not easy to do necessarily. These slaves were also Jefferson's kids' inheritance. So remember, Washington had no kids, so he got away with this. But Jefferson's children, these were his inheritance. So there was all of that. Now here's the problem, however, that I have. Jefferson had to have or should have had some principles. And his daughter at one point wanted to be a nun. And this is what he did. It's not so much that he kept them as slaves. Because he was so heavy in debt and couldn't pay his debt off, he auctioned off the slaves. He sold his slaves because he had no money. He broke up families. And that's the issue that I had with Thomas Jefferson. Okay. Now, I mentioned before the Jeffersons and the Hemmings continued to get together. Sally Hemmings had left to live with 2 sons. And pretty much that's all I need to say about Thomas Jefferson, slavery, and the woman in his life. However, next episode, Thomas Jefferson and his presidency. Believe me, it is also fascinating. There's like a duality to this man. And it continues in his presidency. We're going to be talking more about that in the next episode. But in the meantime, subscribe and also comment below. This is John Franklin. Thank you.